Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor. And, it's been a while. It's been a couple weeks. It's the last episode, I think, was a Christmas episode, and that was pre recorded, which we had a great debate over Santa Claus on this channel. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you had a good Christmas. And, Christmas season's still going on. So I hope you all are enjoying your time with family, relaxing a little bit, probably getting back to work, but still. I have the pleasure today to be talking to Marcus Furius Pertinax back on the channel. We are going to be talking about the Imperial idea, and we're going to be using Charles Coulombe's Blessed Charles of Austria, a holy emperor, and his legacy to guide us. Welcome back to the show, Marcus.
Cheers, Connor. Thank you, my friend. I know this streams have been a couple of weeks/months in the planning, but we got here at last. The back end of 2023 got a bit crazy, so I haven't had too many sort of free slots. But no, thank you for being patient. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate the invite. And I know we sort of kind of we've been back and forth discussing what we'd canvas and how to sort of do this discussion, because this is the thing. I mean, if we're going to go back to sort of like the birth of the Roman Republic and then the transition of the Republic to Imperium, and we'll touch on the Persian Shah. And I think even in the dot points, you're sort of saying, like, the idea of sort of King David's legacy played out by by King Herod, and the transition of the Roman Principate to the Dominate, and the formation of, you might say, the Western imperial ideal. It has its origins in quite hallowed antiquity, and it's not an easy thing to sort of explain, or certainly it's not a brief you can't get to the conclusion in 10 minutes. So
Well,
it's a rich conversation in its own right.
Well, yeah, you're perfect for not brief conversations, Marcus.
Exactly.
So it's you're the absolute right person to have on, especially because I wouldn't say I know nothing about the ancient world, but I certainly am less familiar with it than anything post Christianization, like that. That is much more my wheelhouse of things. So when
you mean pre-Christianization?
My wheelhouse is post Christianization.
Oh, sorry, your wheelhouse is, yeah. Sorry, yeah, of course, yeah.
Anyway, so
Indeed.
you're here to help me understand the ancient world. So I wanted to start with a passage from the book, from Charles Coulombe's book. I'll have a link in the description to the book for anybody who's interested. The first chapter is called The Imperial Idea, and it's where I got the idea for this discussion. And later this week, or next week, I will be having Charles Coulombe on to discuss sort of the non-ancient aspects of Christian imperial idea, not just the ancient part. So I'm gonna read this part, and it's this. So for him, it will say him in it. It's referring to Blessed Charles, but the point of this is to get an idea of where the imperial idea came from. For him, as for his predecessors, it described a supranational entity that, for the most part, successfully carried on what to us must seem a great paradox. For such an entity, on the one hand, encompassed many diverse regions, jealous of their local liberties, subsidiarity, as we would say today, with the emperor whose authority, as opposed to power, was supreme, that authority derived from God and the church and hallowed by tradition, was exercised by that emperor over each of his provinces and peoples according to their own laws. This was the imperial idea that Blessed Charles inherited, and to understand him, we must understand it. Marcus, what do you make of that?
Well, I was going to say that's obviously the impression, well, not the impression. It's an accurate statement of particularly sort of how it would play out with Austria-Hungary, and I suppose being something of a multinational empire, certainly a multi-ethnic one, and the idea of sort of like a balance sought between this sort of idea of, I don't want to use the word omnipotent because it's not necessarily omnipotent, but of absolute power characterized in an emperor, a sort of a figurehead that sits at the top of this hierarchy, but then sort of also being uh, a little bit sort of softened isn't the correct term, but um, like carried out also with this idea of noblesse oblige, to use the French phraseology. That it's not necessarily like it's not a permissiveness to rule by tyranny or to rule by fiat or to act in the manner of like a despot, but that the sort of governance by an emperor is a system that is not only functional in the real world, but actually corresponds with, say, for us as Christians, for us as Catholic, certainly as Catholics, that is sort of obedient to the laws of God, even, and to some regard is sort of the a more true expression of sort of, you might say, divine order on earth, as it were, and that the emperor somewhat embodies that idea. Hence, in like even in the Western conception, very much this is where it does deviate to some degree from the East, is that we kind of have this idea of sort of divine rule or divine right, and that sort of there's this sort of relationship between an emperor who rules over their empire and or a king, even. The concept's the same, because I got to think this was also embodied by the kings of England, the kings of France, the kings of Castile in Spain, kings of Naples, that sort of thing, king of Hungary even. That like for instance, their rulership was sort of you know ordained by the Almighty, and that with great powers comes great responsibilities and duties. Even I always think of a phrase. Was it? I think Franz Josef said that my position exists to protect my subjects from their politicians, which I think is a wonderful turn of phrase. Um,
Wasn't it
but yeah,
Theodore Roosevelt who was really confused by that prospect?
I'm not aware of that, but
I
it wouldn't
think he
surprise me though.
I think he was traveling and he asked Franz Josef, why does your job exist? I
Mm.
think that's where it comes from. I think he was responding to
I see. I didn't know that.
Theodore
Interesting.
Roosevelt, but I could be wrong. That's
Yeah.
just in.
Although, if true, that's actually. Oh, I presume it is true, but that would actually make quite the fascinating conversation. I would love to be an insect on the wall listening to that conversation, because I mean, Teddy Roosevelt and Franz Josef are two very large figures of the beginning of this. Oh, well, the century just gone. The 20th century. They're very sort of titanic political figures in their own right.
Indeed, and they
Mm,
couldn't be further away from each other in sort
mm,
of, I guess, ideal, but maybe
yeah.
similar in like personality type.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly, yeah. Or at least like both being extreme, sort of like larger than life characters, insofar that if Teddy was this sort of, adventurous safari, boisterous, combative uh exponent of like American culture that was, young and vital. Because at the point in time, the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, that's the kind of nation America was. I mean, it still had a frontier, it still had the Wild West. It was still, you know, that kind of a place, that people could, arrive at Ellis Island, penniless, and then sort of in 20 years be a captain of industry. Like America was that kind of a country, whereas Austria-Hungary was very much, sort of kind of semi-feudal still, very much a country governed by the old rules of Europe and the old order. And, like Vienna was one of the oldest sort of continuously maintained courts in Europe. And, Austria-Hungary, you got to think, the emperors of Austria-Hungary been sort of elected, sort of for the most part, until it was abolished in Napoleon's time, had been almost the continuous monarchs of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries, and held leadership of Germany until the rise of Prussia. Um, so you very much have this legacy, and this system that Americans would feel almost perplexing and antiquated. And they're very much contradictory in that sense. And not to say that the Austria-Hungary sort of lacked vitality, but it just, you're comparing an old society with a new society that have very different energies, very different sort of. If you consider a society or a country as an organism, one is older, one is younger, and they have different qualities, I suppose, is the point I'm trying to make.
yeah, one's trying to expand, but also one's extremely chaotic, and the other one is more stable,
Mm,
at least regularly. I would say
yes,
Austria-Hungary was pretty stable. War is the only thing that made it unstable.
correct. Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and to some degree too, maybe it's like, for example, take like Prussia, right, which was predominantly sort of Eastern Middle German with smatterings of Polish minorities, shall we say. But for the for the most part, it was essentially a uniform state, with a
yeah.
uniform culture, and you have this slight divergence between Lutherans, Protestants, and Catholics. But for the most part, it was relatively a uniform East, like Prussian German society. It was like Austria-Hungary because it was a kind of country that it was, and it was governed from Vienna with an Austrian sort of Germanic Austrian elite, and
Mhm.
mostly German and Austrian nobility that governed over parts of northern Italy, Lombardy and Venetia, and what Italians call the Istria, but the littoral province, right? It governed parts of Croatia and Dalmatia and Slovenia. It governed the regions of what we understand as Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland and Bohemia, Moravia. It governed what was a very large Hungarian sub-state within Austria. It also had Romanians, and it had Serbians, and it had all these sort of minority groups, and it had to find a way to actually stitch these people together into a cohesive identity, which was a very different system to what Prussia had in that sense.
A lot more work, yes. But yeah, so
I would
you
have
were
hated to. I would have hated to be a commander in the Austro-Hungarian army because depending what unit you got and what soldiers you had, you would have had to have learnt like a second or third language just to make orders understood.
yeah, I almost think it'd been fun though to be like a sort of carrying out the orders of
Yeah,
not in the military, but in the sort of
like the
trying to,
government
yeah, the
side.
government,
Yeah,
like trying to figure out
bureaucracy.
that.
Yeah, indeed.
Definitely a challenge.
Although the good thing is if you traveled all the way from essentially Vienna to Prague to Bratislava, which was Pressburg then, all the way down to Zagreb, wherever you were in the sort of the empire as such, every street sign would have had, I suppose, like the native language of that region, but then every there'd always be like the German as well, because obviously being a part of a German state, like everything would have a German name attached to it. So
Is that like
there's kind of this,
It's like America and Spanish in some sense these days.
yeah,
So,
exactly.
I'm getting like I don't I'm interested to see, you obviously wouldn't deal with this, but for other Americans, I'm seeing a lot. I'm getting like ads on YouTube and stuff like that, even on TV sometimes in Spanish. And I'm like, I have no idea what like how this is functional, because like
Yeah,
it's gonna be like half the people, or like more than half the people won't know what the ad is for or
yeah.
what it's saying to you. So I just think that's a really bad marketing situation.
Yeah. Yes, the,
But
the joys
anyways,
of modern day and saturation advertising, but that's another discussion for another day.
exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so uh, we go, or I'll bring us back to the origins of the imperial idea. So with the Romans, they are sort of notorious for the fact that they overthrew their kings and established a republic. Now, how did that happen? Who were their kings, and how did they get rid of them?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm back. Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing is that the if you take the legacy of the Roman state from its two extremities, right, and people are going to roll their eyes because like, oh, he goes Furious the Berserker. um, we reckon if we consider, well, so it depends. There's sort of two start dates. There's either the apocryphal kind of almost semi mythological foundation of Rome, the settlement or the state, and that means essentially adhering to the mythology to some degree of Aeneas, and descendant from that the uh, the stories of Romulus and Remus. And again, one doesn't have to necessarily accept that as gospel truth for there to be, you know, how like sometimes a historical truth is shrouded in a mythos. You know, like we don't necessarily know if you know, the Trojan War was sort of born of the will of Zeus, for instance, but we know that Troy, the city, if he existed, if you get what I mean, right? Like it's, we don't necessarily know the complete truth, but we know there's something pertaining to a truth between the lines, if you get what I mean. Like,
Yeah, even
you
though
know, like
people had spent so long trying to convince people that it didn't exist, right?
exactly right. Like, oh, it's purely mythological, purely mythological. And then, you know, like a German archaeologist like discovers like 7 layers to Troy, you know, eventually. So if we take the earliest reckonings of the Roman identity or the Roman state, we go back to 753. If we talk about the establishment of the Roman Republic, and we know this because a lot like the Greeks, the Romans were avid writers, and the Romans recorded their own doings essentially. That the Roman state was, you know, if we follow our, you know, our calendar and our references of history, we go back to, I think it was like 509 BC, if memory serves me right.
Yeah,
So
they were overthrown in 509 BC.
yeah, so this is and again, Rome was sort of, how can I put this? It wasn't necessarily like a puppet as such, but kind of like a sort of like a semi-vassal state, a vassal state of the Etruscans, because essentially the Etruscans would, um, uh, a member of their nobility would serve essentially as a king of Rome.
Hmm.
But there's this whole sort of, again, mythos, a mythological story of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, and it's actually interesting that Superbus remains a in terms of linguistic etymology, superbia in Italian is basically a synonym for arrogance. Like it still exists in language today,
Wow, okay.
in Italian lexicon. So um, Tarquinius Superbus was the last Etruscan king of Rome and was basically chased out by a populace that had grown tired of the sort of the Etruscan yoke upon Rome. And there's sort of like a bit of a backstory about the rape of one of the daughter senators, and you know, the people turned on Tarquinius. And again, it's that whole idea of, you know, when kingship goes astray and becomes indulgent and um, you know, like self-gratifying and negligent of his duties, you know, kind of like how we would picture, you know, like a Nero or a Caligula or, you know, a dysfunctional emperor of that sort, you know, in Roman history. And
Would
then
these be would their kings be seen as like god kings like many other ancient kings?
I can't say I have sufficient knowledge of Etruscan history
Okay.
to be able to answer that question honestly, because like, just it's a case of I'd rather not, you know, not lie about it, but I'd rather not speculate on something I'm not sufficiently versed on. But but it was a case that there was obviously this instance, and whether that the sort of the overthrow of the monarchy um, is tied to that particular event, or whether sort of it's just something that the Romans then mention later as kind of essentially an excuse. You know, the traditional narrative of this is that uh, uh, Tarquinius basically rapes a noblewoman by the name of Lucretia, which is interesting because in medieval history, as we come to know, like with
Borgias?
the Borgias, yeah, you know,
Yeah,
like Lucrezia again is sort of like the woman who's the center of controversy. You know,
that's funny.
you know, it's the whole idea of that. You know, like history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and sometimes the characters have the same names. You know, and so one of the oldest families of Rome in terms of, you know, like its founding cadre of nobles, uh, the Brutii, Lucius Junius Brutus, basically leads a rebellion of the aristocracy that casts out the Sextus. Well, firstly, Sextus Tarquinius, which I believe is the father of Tarquinius Superbus, and they're both basically ejected from the city. And and Romans devise this system. Essentially, it's like a what do you call, like a republican sort of pseudo-democratic diarchy of two consuls that are elected every year, and amongst the chamber of senators, and it's a system that basically continues for more or less the next 500 years. But the thing is, it's a system that the Romans obviously devised for themselves, as because when they establish the republic, they begin their system. Rome is essentially a city-state. Rome itself is I don't like to use the word vassal. Sorry, a puppet, because it's not necessarily right, but it was something of a vassal state at the southern periphery of the Etruscan state, which in itself is a bit inaccurate, because Etruria was almost more of like a loose confederation of cities that shared an identity. Because even today, we don't necessarily know the origins of the Etruscans. There's so much speculation that, are they a remnant of the Sea Peoples that, brought about the ends of the Bronze Age? Were they refugees from Troy? Which also plays into the origin story of the Romans. If you read Virgil's Aeneid, and the idea of like the kings of Alba Longa, which is actually just south of Rome, granted this territory on the Tiber to these group of refugees that become like the nascent Roman people. There's a whole bunch of mythology that you could get into as to what the actual origin story is. But the Etruscans, like we know with the Romans, for instance, at the very least, if they do prescribe to that story, then they would have intermingled with native Italic Latin peoples. We sort of know if we follow the archaeology, we sort of know what the sort of the ethnogenesis is of the Italic and Latin peoples that populated that part of Italy, right? And the Romans eventually become well, they are that, and they become exponents of that. But nonetheless, they fall under the political sovereignty of the Etruscans to their north. And so the Etruscans kind of have like this, what you would call like a confederation. The Etruscans, they sort of, it's a strange kind of system, but they kind of like appoint kings more than anything, or they sort of like have this sort of rule by like self-governing sort of city states, and then they sort of like elect their leaders, but to a position of kind of like what the Romans would develop later with the role of the dictator, that it would be sort of like absolute power but with limited term, if you get what I mean. And then they would have to relinquish power after a given term. I've always thought that the Romans based the idea of the dictatorship on the Etruscan model, but applied it with a more like, for example, the Romans would have like a political limitation to the dictator, and they actually had a model by which they would use it, like a framework. It's like, this is what a dictator is, and the Senate can vote for this, but it's a position of absolute power for a limited term of office. And I think the Romans kind of formalized that as a distinct function of government, which is why actually, at some point in time, I'm actually going to go back on Oren McIntyre's channel. I should have to do more reading about this. But it's this. It's why I viscerally hate the word dictator being used in modern lexicon, because it's actually really, really inaccurate. Well,
that's why I was thinking it was kind of funny when, I don't know if you heard Trump say he would be a dictator for a day or something like that. It actually reminds me more of that, because like that would actually be a somewhat truthful understanding of the term.
Exactly. I mean, essentially, whenever an American president passes an executive order, they're basically acting as a function of a dictator. And I don't even mean that in a pejorative sense, but in terms of function, basically utilizing the executive branch is acting in the manner of a dictator, not in the way that, MSNBC or CNN or BBC use the word dictator, but in the actual formal Roman context, passing an executive law, bypassing arms of government, is actually acting in that way. Which isn't a value judgment, it's just a description of function. So it's kind of interesting that Romans do this. But the thing is, what's actually interesting is that the dictatorship is actually a really critical role, because that within Roman history, and that there's a number of instances, and particularly like my namesake, right? I mean, Furius and Pertinax are two different people in Roman history, and the first one is Marcus Furius Camillus, who I actually consider one of the best Romans, and I think one of the greatest exponents of Roman virtue, and I think one of the most important figures of Roman history that's kind of overlooked. A lot of people, I mean, and I say this as a fan of Julius Caesar, for instance, but there's all these figures that come along sort of after, whether it's Scipio Africanus or it's Quintus Fabius Maximus or it's Flamininus or Pompey or Sulla or Caesar, whoever it is, and they get like a lot of the oxygen in the discussion. They get a lot of the sort of notoriety, and they get all the attention from people who like history. But sort of Marcus Furius Camillus is this sort of almost, again, kind of, well, it's not mythological. It's almost certain that he did exist, but it's sort of so far in Rome's past that it's sort of semi-mythological. Like even his quotations are considered to be semi-mythological. And we only sort of have them because the Romans wrote about themselves. People like Virgil went back and discussed it. Polybius, even though he was ethnically Greek, Polybius wrote a lot of this stuff in his work as well. And so we sort of have to rely on these sort of scholars and historians who wrote about Rome's own past from their own sources, but those primary sources were lost. So we sort of trusting the second-hand sources, so to speak, even though they were still from ancient times. But Furius Camillus was elected dictator, I believe, on several occasions. And what's actually interesting is that he took command of the Roman army and captured the city of Veii, which is just north of Rome. Veii is probably close to like what is now the northern border of where Lazio intersects with Tuscany in modern day Italy. And the Romans had been besieging Veii for at least 20 years. It was actually like a really, really prolonged siege, and every source talks about it being a long siege, so there's no dispute about that. But Furius conceives of a way to undermine the city and to utilize because even like in those times, even though the Romans were more modest in their architecture and construction, they were still very good at what they did. And most Italian towns had cisterns and aqueducts on a much smaller scale than the like the aqueducts you see in like the Imperial age. They built like hundreds of miles or hundreds of kilometers of aqueducts, and they pass over entire provinces. Like that comes a lot later. But most cities in Italy, because of, you look at the topography with Italy being quite mountainous with the Dolomites and the Apennines and whatever, most of these larger places would have had their own cisterns and reservoirs and water, that sort of stuff, right? So he actually uses the architecture of the waterworks to basically undermine his way into Veii and captures the city. But then, because he doesn't offer a sufficient offering to Mars, and I believe there was almost a semi-rebellion amongst the soldiers because he didn't distribute enough loot. Because he actually, it was more that he suggested that Veii should be resettled by Romans rather than burnt to the ground and sacked. Because if you look on a map, Veii kind of protects, because the Tiber kind of comes in from the Tyrrhenian and then sort of goes north up the Italian peninsula. And sort of he figured that it was in a very strategic location, which he's right, actually, because Veii kind of protects the approach to Rome from the north. And then he was cast out and exiled to a place called Ardea, which is not far from sort of modern-day Anzio. And then, of course, when the Gauls made their way down Rome in 390 BC and basically destroyed the Roman army, the Battle of River Alia, Furius is essentially their last hope. And with a ragtag band of veterans and liberated convicts and mercenaries, he makes his way to Rome and actually saves Rome from the Gauls, or from the Senones, technically speaking. But and liberates Rome, and then he's appointed dictator several times afterwards, because the Romans are extremely appreciative for the fact that he saved them. So it's sort of interesting how these sort of things come in cycles, if you get what I mean. And like I'm saying, he acts in the manner of a dictator, which is it's not Saddam Hussein, it's not Muammar Gaddafi, it's not the Austrian painter, it's not
Mussolini,
Kaiser Wilhelm or Mussolini. It's its own thing. That
actually, are you putting those together in the same Kaiser Wilhelm in the same grouping?
But like in the sense that like the media, particularly the Western media, Times, has framed all these people of being of a similar ilk.
I'm not sure they know who Kaiser Wilhelm even is.
Oh, they probably don't. But like no, but I'm saying, if you look at like World War I propaganda posters,
sure,
and the narrative that was pushed by Western media to justify entry into the war, for instance, or to actually to fight the Germans, it's always the next best or worst thing, and there's always the guy that we're fighting is always the pinnacle of evil. That's the point I'm trying to make. And the specter of dictatorship is a part of that, particularly coming from like a liberal West, a liberal sort of Anglospheric tradition. They've always used that specter to like, oh, this is the enemy of our traditions and this is the enemy of our worldview because dictator, even though the word doesn't fit, like it's actually really, really ill-fitting, and it's not like it's actually definitively wrong, you know.
I see why you look to Furious as sort of a namesake,
Mm,
because it sounds like a very inspiring story, as well as the success. I think
mm,
there's a lot of people that look often towards people who are defeated
mm,
as inspiration, and
mm,
uh, it's interesting that you found somebody you can respect that was successful.
mm. Well, you got to think in sort of simultaneously, he's something of a redeemer, a victor, and sort of like a man who rebuilds his own image amongst his own people. You know, if you were expelled from your country, there would be significant part. When I say you, not just you specifically, but anyone watching this, right? And this includes myself. If you're expelled from the country that you fought for and that you were a general of their armies and you were a patriot and a senator for, and you were expelled by those people, it'd be understandable if a part of you went, well, now the Gauls are invading, you've
Good.
expelled me, you know, you've made this bed, now sleep in it. Like
Yeah.
that's a perfect. I wouldn't call it a noble response, but it's a perfectly understandable response for someone to feel animosity. But no, he busied himself utilizing what resources he had, and on the pure because the Romans basically have this thing. It's called the Mos Maiorum, which is essentially like the Roman equivalent of what we would say understand as like the chivalric code or the samurai sort of notion of bushido, like the idea of like having virtues that describe the performative ideal of a man, shall we say, or a patriot or a leader. And one of the Roman virtues is auctoritas, which is the ability to sort of have charisma and to utilize oratory and and to be able to express intellect as a means of being able to rally people to a cause or to rally people in defense of country or to liberate the country. And someone like Furius Camillus would have had to have extraordinary auctoritas to go to these little colonies of veterans and bring them out of retirement. They'd fought for the Republic for decades. It's like, guys, one more, like, get your armor. We got one more fight. We have to save Rome.
Yeah.
And then, hey, listen, you're a prisoner. You've been imprisoned by the Republic. Either you rot in this prison forever, or we're going to give you swords and shields, and you come liberate Rome with us. Like, that still takes persuasion, you
Yeah,
know. And then with
definitely.
whatever money he had, whoever was like whatever mercenary bands were around at the time, he's like, all right, guys, you might die, but if I give you, 100 sesterci, will you join this ragtag army? And that's what they do, and he does. He saves Rome. And I don't know if you know much about the because Marcus Furius Camillus is called the second founder of Rome.
Hmm.
That's sort of his title essentially, and that's what his people who wrote about him later gave him basically that epithet. Like in the same way that like Belisarius and Aetius and Constantine, a lot of them are called the last Roman. Like they're sort of given that epithet
Hmm.
subsequently, right? Marcus Furius Camillus was given that sort of epithet by people who wrote about him later. But the thing is that for he's called the second founder of Rome. But one of the really intriguing things, and again, this is where history and myth start to get murky and sort of like meld into like being the one thing. But there's a Latin phraseology called "vae victus," which means "woe to the vanquished," and that is allegedly what Brennus, who was the leader of the Senones, said to the Roman Senate when they started negotiating surrender, because it was a case of the Romans were stuck in the Capitoline Hill, like around the Senate buildings, basically like a mini Acropolis, right? And they were starving. But the Gauls, because they didn't bring supplies with them, were also starving. So basically, it was a case of which side was going to starve out first. So that's when they decided to negotiate, and and the Romans, the senators were sort of saying to Brennus, "Well, you're using scales that because basically they like cheated on the scales, like for the scale weights." And the story goes that Brennus just bursts out like, "Way Victus, like woe to the vanquished, like you're defeated. It's by my rules or no rules." And he throws his sword on the scales, and it's at that moment that Furius Camillus enters the city and enters enters the Capitoline Hill at the lead of his ragtag army, and he says to Brennus in reply, I can't remember actually how to say it in Latin, but basically along the lines of, we Romans will liberate, or we defend our patrimony not with gold but with iron. So it's basically this whole thing of like, we're not negotiating our existence, we're going to fight you for this city. And then he proceeds to defeat Brennus. So that there's essentially the our foundation story of what dictatorship is.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. It sounds a little bit like the opposite of Denethor and Peter Hitchens. Like
Essentially,
sort of the opposite of let it all burn. It's no use. We've already lost it.
Yeah. If Camillus Furius was Peter Hitchens, he would have stayed sulking in his villa in Ardea, and the Gauls would have burnt Rome down to the ground.
Well, he would have been like, they didn't listen to me, so can't help anymore. Not possible anymore. And Denethor would have just thrown himself from the from the walls anyways. So but yeah, so very interesting that sort of this is the system. Do you think the reason that they got rid of the kings had more to do with the fact that they weren't ruling themselves, like somebody else was ruling them, or was it just the system that they wanted to have, wanted it to be more controlled, I guess?
I think elements of both. I think eventually Rome proved to be one of the more prosperous cities. When I say city, I use the word quite loosely because Rome was still a relatively small place at this point. I mean, I don't know what the population would have been, but I mean, Rome at this point hadn't even built its fortifications, to my knowledge. I'm pretty sure the Severian walls are built later, but it had basically because they say that the Rome is a city on 7 hills. They have the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Esquiline. These hills are sort of symbolize Rome. And like, you go to Rome today and you can actually kind of still see and walk amongst them, because it is noticeable that Rome is built on these hills, the Janinculum, etc. So at this point, obviously, like those, rather than being like a number of little villages dotted across these hills, at some point in time, these settlements converge into like a single settlement. And Rome, because of its position along the Tiber, its proximity to Ostia, which is the port, and given the fact that when you go inland, even from Rome, you only need to go maybe 50 or so kilometers out of Rome heading eastwards, and it becomes extremely hilly, like almost mountainous, and it's a very difficult place to traverse, which is actually why, for instance, like in a military standpoint, it's why Rome, the Italians basically didn't fight in a phalanx like the Greeks did. They did have a phalanx, but the Italian, like the various peoples of Italy, whether it's the Samnites or the Romans themselves, or even the Etruscans and the Lucanians, basically don't fight in the Greek style because it's too difficult in Italy to actually fight in a phalanx. And that's why they sort of end up all changing and fighting in different ways that we end up, when you read the histories, you sort of find out how they fight. And it's very different from the Greek system because of that. But nonetheless, the point I'm making is that Rome is this really important junction, both to see whether, like, because the Tiber empties out into the Tyrrhenian Sea, which means then it's close to trade routes to Carthage, to Sardinia, to Sicily, which was obviously Greek back then, or mostly Greek, part of Magna Graeca. It had a trade with Spain. It was very important from that standpoint. And then going up and down Italy, unless you went all the way to the East Coast, it was basically no way of traversing north-south. So Rome was very important from that standpoint. Also, when from the north, if you're heading southwards, Rome was the gateway to the breadbasket of the south. Because up until like the later Roman like nation and republic, if you want to call it that, absorbed places like North Africa, Sicily, Egypt to some extent, and even parts of Spain, the majority of Rome's agricultural produce came from not the like not the actual south of Italy proper, not like the heel or the toe, but what we sort of now know today is Campania, which is the province around Napoli, um, was a breadbasket for the burgeoning city state. You know, places like Capua and Beneventum, which are still city or towns today in modern day Italy, and even up until recent times were still sort of epicenters of Roman agriculture, of Italian agriculture, was so vital to the Republic, and actually even prior to the like the Romans liberating themselves, you know, for the Etruscans to actually access the south, they had to go through Rome. So it was a really important juncture geographically speaking.
Gotcha.
And so what I'm saying is that um, that ensured Roman prosperity as like a subject of the Etruscans, which made them relatively powerful within like the Etruscan network, within the Etruscan sort of what do you call it, like this sort of loose confederation, right?
So
And
it
it
was
made the
easier for them to, or more incentive for them
mm,
to, or give them a chance to overthrow their rulers.
correct. So they had enough, you might say, intrinsic strength and material resources to be able to do it, and then they sort of realized, hey, we actually are wealthy enough to govern ourselves. And then if you sort of take these stories of the Tarquini as fact, or at least there's a degree of historical truth to it, then essentially the Romans were tyrannized. And eventually, as often happens with kind of any revolution, there's always that spark, you know, whether it's you know, whether it's sort of, you know, Henry VIII not getting his divorce from the Pope, or whether it's, you know, the Boston Tea Patriots throwing the tea into the harbor, you know, there's you know, there's always that spark moment.
Spark, yeah.
And in the case um of the rebellion essentially of the Romans against the Etruscans, you know, and being led by Lucius Junius Brutus, it was the rape of Lucrezia.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
Um, and they also seemingly were intellectually far enough that they came upon the system that they were able to create with dictators and consuls and, sort of the republic that
Mm.
lasted a decent while at least.
Mm. Yeah, just to buttress what I was making before is that it was absolutely functional and actually a very efficient system for what Rome started out was, which was as a city state that governed a relatively small hinterland and with like a couple of allied settlements in its periphery. But it's sort of interesting that Rome works up until it sort of gains domination of Italy. So this is like you know, the Romans fight the regional wars against the Sabines and the Etruscans and the Samnites in the south. There's actually, you know, a couple of Samnite wars where they absorb the state the state of Samnium into the Roman sphere. The Romans come to dominate central Italy, and then eventually they press southwards, which is where they start to interact with the Greeks, and that's the whole Pyrrhus thing and the Pyrrhic Wars and the idea of the Pyrrhic victory, because they fight 3 battles against Pyrrhus in the south of Italy, and they eventually absorb like the Greek cities of mainland proper into the Republic. But once Italy becomes more of a than just a local power and sort of becomes the regional hegemon, you start to see the cracks appear. And this is really a case of once Rome fights the Punic Wars and starts to attain foreign territories and needs to appoint governors outside of Italy. And this is where also Rome starts having a lot of wealth pour into it, because it's not just a city state that sort of trades locally, or, you know, it's just a node of trade amongst a whole bunch of other powers. You know, it's not just trading with Syracuse as a city state, or, you know, Carthage as a merchant republic, but actually Rome itself is starting to bring in a lot of goods for itself. You know, like as the Romans become victorious and successful and affluent, their own elites and their own, even, you know, I use the word middle class really loosely here, but like their own sort of middle classes, as it were, start to have an appetite for foreign goods. And so Rome starts to become this sort of, I hate to use the word black hole, but, you know, essentially this void that starts sucking in resources, right? And, you know, and
Yeah.
it eventually becomes like its own worst enemy in this regard. And it's interesting how writers such as you know,
And decadent,
Sallust.
decadent.
This is the thing. Like people, whether it's Cato the Elder, it's Cicero, and more of the like the philosopher types, say like or just writers, people like Sallust and Florus. And I think even Plutarch touches on this, where they sort of speculate that, like, oh, the annexation of Carthage was the worst thing because we lost our enemy that kept us on our toes, or, once we annexed Macedon and our treasury trebled in size, it ruined our morals. And like they were cognizant of this in their own time. They speculated this sort of, to use a modernism, affluenza, like their own success sort of became their own worst enemy, and sort of their own writers kind of realize this. And it's sort of interesting how you have this system that is so efficient to govern a city state becomes dysfunctional as it gets larger. Like the Romans have difficulty keeping its generals loyal. It can't administer a republic without a standing army, because rather than just, oh, Italy's been invaded, here we'll just raise 5-10 legions and drive out the barbarians or whatever. Once they actually start having provinces in Spain and in Gaul and in Greece or Macedon or North Africa, it becomes like a case of they need defense. Like they've got these far-flung provinces they have to protect from foreigners. But once you have a standing army, it's kind of like the problem with America. Like, if you read the early the Federalist Papers and like the writings of your founders, they all understood the danger of a standing army in the context of a republican democratic kind of system. But Rome has the same problem back then, and it sort of was a part of its undoing, because what eventually happens. Marius sort of becomes like essentially like a generalissimo of the republic. Sulla marches on Rome. Sulla liquidates his opponents, and then sort of a generation later, Caesar marches on Rome when the senators give him a fait accompli. And then a generation after that, you have these wars between, firstly, between Octavian and Mark Antony as the inheritors of Caesar's legacy against the so-called liberators, Brutus and Cassius Longinus. And then at the very end, you have like this climactic struggle between Mark Antony and Octavian. And this is just like that system atrophying at its absolute maximal extent, and just proving that system was not functional at an empire level as an imperium, which I suppose, to sort of get back, we've been on a massive Roman tangent, but
No,
sort of
it's good.
To cut back to the core of this talking, this discussion and the bullet points we're sort of wanting to touch on, that strangely enough in the West, like even though, for instance, the Etruscans did style themselves as kings, if we consider the sort of apocryphal mythological past, if they came from the East, it would make sense, because the idea of sort of like kingship was far more an idea from the Eastern Mediterranean than the Western one. I know, for instance, if you like, again, look for shreds of truth amongst Greek mythology, there was a king of Argos, there was a king of Sparta, there was a king of Mycenae, there was a king of all these parts of Greece, like the Trojan War, Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, for instance, right? But they're almost more like princedoms than actual kingdoms as we would understand them in the more like in eras closer to our time. Like, say, if you compare it to, say, like Angevin England or Plantagenet England or Capetian France, like it's a very different form of kingship, right? But then eventually a lot of these kingships sort of vanish in the sort of the culmination of the Trojan War, and then sort of the Bronze Age collapse and all of that. And then in the West, you kind of have this system of, you have a Roman Republic. You have the Carthaginian sort of what you could describe as sort of an aristocratic merchant republic that is sort of headed by a few noble families. The Barkids, the Hanids, like there's a few other families I can't think of, but the prominent families of Carthage sort of govern it as an aristocratic merchant republic. If you go further north, because I wouldn't call myself by any means an expert on like the Celtic Gallic sphere, but I sort of have an admiration for them, because much is said about like, oh, we're the civilized Greeks and Romans and they're the barbarians, but the barbarians are rather less uncivilized than people give them credit for. And the Gauls and I mentioned the Germans in the same kind of stretch, but particularly, say, like the Gauls and like the Western Celts, there's this idea that they sort of live in tribes, and they might elect leaders every so often, but they're sort of governed on a day-to-day basis by like a sort of almost like a council of elders, as it were. It's actually quite their societies are hierarchical, they are stratified, but they're not nearly as distinct as say like the Roman or the Greek systems were. And there was actually I actually kind of don't like the word because it's sort of we have a modern context to it, but it was almost a bit egalitarian insofar that uh, even the nobles and the shall I call them peasants in a Gallic village or a Gallic tribe, there wasn't a huge distinction between them in terms of how wealthy or how much land they did or didn't own. They kind of like just sort of got on and did their own thing without too much animosity or too much like uh, class animosity, I suppose is the word I could use. But it's a system that worked and it worked at their level. But had, for example, like a Gallic tribe did what the Romans did with like the Averni or the Aedui or whoever, the Nervii, conquered all of Gaul, then that system wouldn't have worked. Like at a national level, an empire level, that system works because they lived in tribes and they had their own areas and their own regions and they governed themselves. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the West had these systems which weren't as autocratic or despotic as in the East. Whereas if you look at the East, right, Lydia had kings, Assyria had kings, the Mitanni had kings. You know, one of the big trading cities of the East prior to the Bronze Age collapse was a place by the name of Ugarit. Ugarit was ruled by a king. Cyprus had a king. Egypt had the pharaohs. And prior to the rise of Persia, as in Cyrus unifying the Iranian peoples into what we come to know as the Persian Empire, its predecessor, the Medians, or Media, as if you want to call it that, was ruled by essentially like a proto Shah.
Well,
These,
before we get further into the Persians, because I do want to read a passage,
oh
another
sure,
passage about the Persians. But before I do that, I wanted to bring us back a little bit about you mentioned the American Republic and
hmm
comparing it to the Roman Republic. I, the way we're talking about the Roman Republic really makes me like think about how the way I feel about the the current iteration of
hmm
the American Republic and even the
hmm
past American Republic. I wouldn't say I'm a fan of the past American Republic, but it definitely was functional,
hmm
uh, and it certainly has shown itself to be incredibly dysfunctional, uh, because it has become an empire.
mm,
And it was obviously set up to be a system for 13 colonies, for
hmm
13 states, and
yeah,
even with like a lot of land necessarily to expand, but I don't think they really planned that far ahead,
yeah,
and that set them up for really, I think it's been Benjamin Franklin says it's a republic if you can keep it. Well,
mm.
that's not going so well at the moment, and it
Or,
didn't.
also, yeah, I was going to say just to mention, I think if you had shown the founding fathers, whether like John Adams or Washington or Franklin or whoever, Jefferson, if you actually shot if you give them like an almanac, say, that described American involvement in the First and Second World War and possibly the Vietnam War, I think they would have been shocked that the country that they founded
Yeah.
did those things. That it's like we have built an entire air force so that we can deploy to England to bomb Germany. Like we have raised, several divisions of Marines. We have entire, like armored and infantry divisions that form an army corps that's going to land on the beaches of Normandy, all whilst we're doing an island hopping campaign in the Pacific. And that amount of armament, and essentially what would then morph into a standing army that then acted as an umbrella to, in inverted commas, protect the West in the post World War II world, would have absolutely abhorred the founding fathers. That is not what they would
Indeed.
have imagined your country to have become.
Yes, exactly. So it's just
Mm.
the when the founders, or just when people who put together the original legal system or the system in general, when their system is used to accomplish completely different tasks or a completely different sort of vision, it's not going to work very well. Especially, you can give the U.S. founders, even though begrudgingly, in my opinion, some credit for creating something of a successful system, if for what they thought it would be. Um, but yeah,
Mm,
so let's
yeah,
move on to the Persians. You talked a little bit about how they, or you were talking about the Achaemenid dynasty. Is that what you,
yeah, yeah. It can be pronounced different, but Achaemenid
yeah.
doesn't. Yeah, it's all the same. Yeah.
And they conquered their overlords. And then this is
Actually, funnily enough, there's like a similar story. Funnily enough, the Persians and the Romans have very, although for instance, there's no like rape story or anything in the Persian context, but it is this idea of a province that is sort of considered not a backwater, but not the forefront of the empire either, but somewhere that's sort of like an important nexus of trade and influence and whatever, rebelling against its master and then becoming the absolute hegemon, not just of that specific area, but actually like of the meta region. So the rebellion of Cyrus against the Medians, and then Cyrus conquers the entirety of the Median Empire, and then starts conquering its neighbors, the Babylonians, the rump of the Assyrian states. Because at that point, like Assyria disintegrates as a power. By
yeah.
that point, he conquers Lydia. Um, it's not that dissimilar story to the Romans breaking away from the Etruscans, although the Roman expansion is a far more gradual thing. I mean, Cyrus does it within literally his lifetime, more or less.
Yeah.
Whereas
And
for the Romans,
at least they didn't have to deal with such a sort of a tragic incitement.
yes, exactly right. Although there is an instance, I think, if I remember the story correctly, um, there's I'm going to butcher this, and I know like some of my Persian friends are going to be annoyed, but there's
What is it? Just going to
the
be academic agent?
no. It's just interesting. Like I kind of like have like a circle of friends like Italian Twitter and Greek Twitter and Persian Twitter, and it's sort of interesting how these sort of groups will coalesce. But
Is
um,
academic agent in the Persian Twitter, or is he in the
oh no,
English or the
he's
Welsh
probably in
Twitter?
he's probably more the English Twitter, but
Not
but
Wales? Is there no Welsh Twitter?
I have no idea. You have to ask. You have to ask the Welsh people. I'm not remotely Welsh. I have no idea.
Well,
Um,
but I thought you were saying you have friends in all these places. You might
yeah,
know.
we're not Welsh Twitter. I haven't the slightest idea about Welsh Twitter. I
Okay.
have to claim my ignorance on that one. But I think there's something. If I remember this origin story correctly, the last king of the Median Empire, and actually his name has just escaped me for the moment. I actually might just check it out. But there's like a story of like a prophecy that he gets from like a soothsayer or something. Uh, Basically, sort of like it's a bit like that. Like the Herod prophecy that sort of like the man who top you will be born at this time, and then like the Jews mark the red on their door frames, to sort of protect them from this prophecy. And I can't remember the actual biblical story to it, but
So
like the idea of
you're talking about Passover, and
yeah,
then
like Passover, yeah, and the idea of like the man who topples Herod will be born on this day, and
sure.
so they people protect themselves from the prophecy. Um, yeah, yeah. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, I'm trying to think of his name. I think it was Astyages, I think was his name, and he was the last king of Medea, and he had this soothsayer sort of described him in this prophecy that he would be toppled, and I think there was a noble that was going to who was like involved in this prophecy, and uh, uh, there's like some sort of thing where he forced this noble to like eat his own son or something, like invited him for a banquet and then served him his own son, and he was like so shocked that he then this noble ended up like sending his other child, which was ended up being Cyrus, like into the care of like some shepherd, so it takes into like a part of the King David narrative as well,
Oh wow.
you know. um
Okay.
Oh, sorry, not King David. That was hang on, in the reeds. Was that Moses or I'm just going?
Well, David was a shepherd boy.
Yeah, David was a shepherd. That's right. And so
Um,
anyway, the Cyrus is sort of like saved from
but
this.
Moses was saved by being brought into the Egyptian royal family.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So anyway, this Cyrus is kind of saved from this predicament of being um like killed essentially, because it was prophesied that he would take over from the last king of Media. But it so happens that he ended up becoming the call like the king, but the governor of this province, Persis, which is sort of like um it corresponds with where the Elamites were historically, which is like to the east of modern day Iraq, like in that um, part of southern western part of Persia. And he ended up becomes the governor, and then he ends up sort of rebelling against this now aged king of Media, who basically failed in stopping the prophecy from playing out. So again, a lot of that is sort of revealed, is shrouded in mythos and backstory and who knows what. But it's not as well, I suppose rape and cannibalism are both pretty terrible, you
Yeah, I
know,
guess. Never mind. I take that back. I
things.
guess
So yeah,
cannibalism. There.
yeah.
I don't even know how to measure that. Anyways,
Yeah. No,
let's.
but what I'm saying is like these origin stories have commonalities, right?
They
And
rhyme.
they're sort of like almost legitimizing in a sense. Like for the Romans, they were justified in rebelling against um the Etruscans, and so the Persians under Cyrus were sort of to a point where sort of gave themselves this legitimizing factor to rebel against, Astyages of the Median Empire, and then there's like this meteoric rise, and Rome's is far more gradual. There's a lot more competition to prevail in Italy, but then sort of like these two empires reach their zenith, and strangely enough, both become empires. Like the republican system in Rome doesn't last. It sort of it atrophies as Rome expands, and eventually Rome becomes an empire. But Cyrus is really this first person in history who embodies this title of Shah Anshar, which is King of Kings, and it's this
Yes, you're
idea that.
spoiled. You're just trying to spoil the reading.
So, is there another thing you want to bring up?
Do you want me to read the reading or not?
Go. No, no, go. Let's do it.
Okay. So this is in reference to the the way the Persians rule. Um, but where there was various preceding states that had attempted to rule their subjects of various races directly, the Persians preferred to retain the services of locals called satraps, often members of the former royal family, to govern their provinces under them. This system of indirect rule was then was their greatest single contribution to statecraft, and it allowed the formation of the largest governmental unit the planet had yet seen. But the central authorities could hire and fire local satraps. Since the word emperor had not yet been invented, the sovereign had to content himself with the title Shah, King of Kings, which he quite literally was. Moreover, his court was conducted with gorgeous ritual. So it was that ancient Persia was the actual birth of the imperial idea, a collection of ethnically and often religiously diverse peoples, nevertheless held together by shared political loyalties. Also, you had mentioned sort of, uh, I think the sort of the imperial idea part of it in the Roman context, why did we go through all the Roman stuff was because what Rome gives you is sort of the language of empire, and then sort of the origin story of a Western empire from republic to empire, while the East kind of gives you more sort of the um, I guess the structure of rulership of how it's
Hmm.
ruled, um, and then it combined with the sort of the history of Rome, the intellectual stuff of Rome and Greece, and then the structure of rule of the Persians becomes the ancient sort of idea of empire.
Hmm. Yeah, well, quite. What could be said is that I think the the Greeks become the progenitors, or certainly they conceive of these ideas of essentially how to run a Western state. But again, because with the exception of the Macedonian Empire, as in under Philip II and later Alexander, these are all competing sort of, again, essentially city states fighting against each other, and they squabble for literally centuries. Um, and obviously Rome as the founding republic that breaks away from Etruria and the Etruscans is its own city state for a number of centuries as well. But the Greeks kind of conceive of ideas of I like to I like to resort to how Andrew Wallace Hadrill, who's probably one of my favorite classicists as a Greek and Roman historian, sort of he says that it's the Greeks who come up with the idea of the polis. What is it that makes a city, and how does a city function? And then the Romans essentially conceive of the idea of civitas, which is this is the citizen, and it's the citizens who make a city. It is the sort of the civilian human component of that city. So that city, has a like an acropolis. It has a gymnasium. Well, the Romans would obviously build forums. Have an Odeon or a theater. Have a library. All the things that comprise of a polis, physically speaking, and in terms of infrastructure and I don't want to use the word facilities; it's too modern. But in terms of its institutions in a physical context, are conceived of by the Greeks, and then the Greeks sort of conceive of ideas of, the word philosophy is a bit broad, but it's the Greeks who come up with a lot of original ideas of how to ask questions about what is a society and what society ought to be. There's this line of thinkers from sort of Heraclitus all the way down to sort of Aristotle in the Greek sense of themselves being independent before they were conquered by Rome, of how man should think of the world around him and his place within the world, so to speak. And then the Romans, I suppose, take those ideas and those concepts and actually do it in a material sense. The Romans actually play it out, because if the Romans had one advantage over the Greeks in this sense, was that the Romans probably built up a bureaucracy that could manage these things in a practical sense. The Romans had this sort of judicial system that could carry out justice, right? The Romans have like a Senate house by which they could, and a class of people who filled the Senate, which became the governing body of that city, rather than just sort of like, you look at like the end of the Peloponnesian War, and then the Athenians have this, the rule of the 30, and then the rule of the 400, and then they have the oligarchs, and then they're toppled by the Democrats, and then sort of they try to bring about like an entire sort of like to use modern lexicon, like this sort of the liberation of the demos, and that every man has, a say in the agora, and there's no stability, if you get what I mean. Whereas like the Roman system is very consistent and very sort of stratified and layered, and they have like these layers of bureaucracy that can manage the affairs of state. Like for instance, and I've mentioned this in other streams, like at the point where sort of Rome goes from republic to empire, the Romans have a bureaucracy of tens of thousands of people who just operate the aqueducts, right? like but that takes organization at a meta level that is not seen until essentially the pre-modern age, like when Prussia and Britain and the Commonwealth and America are starting to build like railways and highways at the national level. We don't see that for the better part of 1.5 millennia almost, right? And it's actually quite extraordinary. So there's the sort of like this sort of interesting dynamic that the Greeks conceive of these ideas, and then the Romans pragmatically play them out in the real world and manage them at the day-to-day level. But then in the East, credit must be given too, because the only people who really do this at that imperial level is in fact the Persians. And the Persians organize their society. And I have to say, I'm not a specialist in Persia by any means. I really need to do more reading on the Persians. But the Persians do themselves have these sophisticated sort of layers of bureaucracy and management of their empire, Although what can be said is that there's a lot more decentralization, and the particularly like Cyrus and his successors, in order to how can I put this, alleviate the burdens of governing such a vast empire, from whether they were based in Persepolis or Pasargadae or later, Susa. These because Persia kind of moved the capital cities around depending, you know, where they were fighting and who they were fighting, and even in terms of climate. Like for instance, that would be in Mesopotamia during the winter, and then because it got obscenely hot in the summer, that actually moved the capital up into the Zagros Mountains where it was cooler. Like so, they were quite pragmatic in that sense, right? But the Persians would delegate a lot of power to their satrapies, and I know that that's a point that you had, like in your bullet points, is the idea that the Persians, in fact, for the sort of so-called trade-off of earth and water, right? That if simply a leader of a state or a province or whatever, a kingdom, basically bent the knee to the Shah, the King of Kings, they would govern. They would actually keep their territory, but just simply be a vassal of the Persian Empire, a vassal of the Shah, and they would be fairly autonomous, providing they sort of like provided a portion of their taxes to the Persian emperor, and provided troops when called upon. Because when you actually, for example, read about like Alexander's battles against Darius, I think Darius III, he fights him at Graticus, Issus, and Gaugamela. You read about let's say, for example, like the Macedonian phalanx, and like these troops are, these peltasts come from here, this cavalry comes from there, and then Alexander has his Macedonian companions. It's a very sort of like Greco-Macedonian army. It's very, particularly the first half of his campaign is very much, if they're not strictly Macedonians, and they're at the very least all ethnic Greeks. But the Persian army, comparatively, it's like, oh, there's Cappadocian cavalry, there's Kurdish javeliniers, there's Indian light horse, there's a corps of Persian infantry, there's actually a big corps of Greek mercenaries that fight alongside the Persian army. There's contingents from Syria, there's contingents from there's like Armenian infantry, there's like all these there's Bactrian heavy cavalry, there's there's like all I suppose like Arab swordsmen, call it what you wish, but there's all these component parts that sort of contribute to the imperial army, and they're all very disparate contingents. So you very much have this juxtaposition, this sort of dimorphism between the two sides. One is extremely sort of diverse and drawn from all corners of an empire, and then the other one is very ethnocentric and very sort of unified in identity and purpose and language and organization. So that's an interesting sort of differentiation between them.
Indeed, there are sort of that interesting dynamic, and in some sense, there will be empires that are, as you say, sort of monolithic in that way, and then you have the other empires which have this sort of great diversity amongst the peoples, in the future. And I guess you sort of have to. There's a balance to that, and sometimes that's out of necessity, sometimes it's just out of happenstance that comes about.
Quite exactly. But it's kind of interesting that as Alexander marches eastward and conquers more of Persia, and eventually does conquer the Persian in its entirety outright, Alexander actually adopts more sort of Eastern modes and Eastern methods of kingship, to the point where he actually starts to attempt to appeal to his new Persian subjects, to the point where he actually starts to alienate his former like Greek allies and actually a number of his comrades in arms. I mean, there's instances where, even for instance, in terms of arguing with his peers, like he in a drunken rage, I think he ends up impaling is it I always say Hephaestion, but it's not him. He dies, I think, of illness, but it might be like, I think, Clytius the White, or Clytius the Blank, one of the Clytiuses, and like just in a drunken rage, he throws a javelin at him and kills him, because it's some of these Greek, because some of these Greek commanders have been with him since the start, are basically saying, you are no longer Greek, Alexander. Like you are becoming the thing that you sought to conquer. We are Greeks
You've
who
gone
take
native.
pride. You've gone native. In the end, we are men who are proud of our heritage and proud of our traditions. And now you're adopting Persian dress. You've taken a Persian wife, and you want to marry all these Greek officers with Persian women. And what's actually happening here? Basically, it's kind of like an enforced DEI policy of like antiquity, right?
Antiquity DEI.
Is
Well,
essentially,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
But
it's still, you'd argue it would have worked a little. It would have worked better than DEI works today. Um,
I mean, I'm drawing a long bow there. I'm just sort of
yeah, I
humoring
know,
it, but
I
but
know,
the
but
idea of essentially like
yeah.
a forced diversity between Greek and Macedonian components and Persian, which to a point kind of actually succeeded, because Alexander's successor states that sort of followed like after his death, his empire crumbled, and a number of his generals like took a portion each. It's actually why, to a point, the Seleucid Empire survived as long as it did, because for a number of decades, even like one might say a century or two, this sort of amalgam of Greek and Persian culture actually existed in parts of Mesopotamia, parts of Syria, parts of even Western Iran, where some of that integration already taken place. But because of the instability of the world at that point in time, and then the fact that, again, there was something of a migratory wave. You have the Parthians and the steppe people gaining a head of steam in the east and the north, and then the Romans, of this burgeoning power, they actually overrun the Greek homeland and eventually come into contact with the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, etc. They kind of get squeezed out and lose these territories. But it is an interesting thing that Alexander attempted. And given the size of his empire, he had to do something like that. It would be, because even like say with the Romans, they didn't do it in the same way, and their expansion was far more gradual than either Cyrus's or Alexander's. But this is why the Romans used to have like colonia. They would disband a group of legions and put them in this city that was in a foreign province, and then obviously years would go by and those men would integrate with the local population, and they would integrate with the Romans, and there would be this gradual process of assimilation that the Romans actually proved the system worked, because even in the modern day, there's a reason why Spaniards and Italians are very similar.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. Back a little bit to satraps. In my opinion, it's kind of the predecessors to princes. Sort of the way we think of modern prince, or sort of, I guess, not modern, more like medieval princes and their role in empires. You have sort of you have an emperor, and then you might have some kings, and then sort of a little lesser, you'd have princes having authority over a smaller realm, but also having influence. It sort of, in my opinion, sort of comes from satrapies. Is that accurate?
Honestly, to answer that question, I think I probably have to do more reading about Persia, because I don't know enough about the actual Persian system, the real nuts and bolts of the system of satrapies to really answer that question. Although it wouldn't surprise me if there was something of a link between them. I think though the system of the satrapies was trying to ponder this, because on one hand you've got like this Oriental. When I say Oriental, I'm talking in the context of how Europeans saw the Near East. Like I said to you before we went to record, the Greek word Anatolia, which is what up until recent times we call the geographical region where modern day Turkey is, right? Like the Asiatic part of Turkey. The Greeks call it Anatolia, which in Greek means land to the east, because it's the eastern half of the Aegean is east of Greece proper. So Asia Minor, Near East, call it what you want, right? But this idea of sort of like Eastern, I'm trying to think of even how Andrew Wallace Hadrill described it, like Eastern potentates, like styles of governing and Oriental notions of kingship and rulership, undoubtedly do influence the West. They influence Alexander. To some point, they influence even Caesar and Mark Antony via Cleopatra and Egypt. To some degree, Augustus kind of does this when he becomes emperor, but it's still very much with, like a Greco-Roman overtone. But then if we sort of fast forward through Roman history, when Diocles establishes the Tetrarchy and establishes what we call, because that's where the system built by Augustus is called the Principate, which his title Princeps means first among equals, which was obviously not true because he was the emperor, but that was the PR campaign that basically Augustus ran with. But then once Diocles becomes Diocletian, becomes emperor and leads the Tetrarchy, it becomes the dominate. I mean, this is like the Roman word dominus, basically means lord, right?
Mhm.
Because you have like a dominus and a domina, that's the male and feminine in Latin. And like the dominus is the lord and the emperor, without comparison. There's no sort of messing about with this idea of first among equals. Like, no, this is your emperor, and it's a stratified society, and he governs you and rules you, and you do what the emperor tells you, and without any frills attached. And that is drawn from an Eastern inspiration. That is actually, like I said, the description used amongst sort of Roman historians, and I think it was Wallace Hadrill who did use phraseologies like Eastern potentates. It's the idea of styles of Eastern rulership that are then imposed on the West. The idea that sort of any notion of um, I hate to use the word again, but like this kind of like this thread of egalitarianism that runs in Western philosophy is just blotted out by the idea of just like an absolute autocracy of an emperor who rules from on high, which then sort of impacts later on when you sort of have the breakup of West Rome and the rise of like the barbarian kingdoms, which become like the nascent France, nascent England, the nascent Castilian Spain, Burgundy, etc. It's the idea of divine right of kings. Which is tempered by sort of ideas of noblesse oblige and this sort of the estates of the realm, and you have the various sort of classes that fulfill each role, but then you've got what is it the king, the nobles, and the people, and they sort of sit within this sort of self-sufficient and mutually supportive triangle, which doesn't quite exist in the East in very much the same way. But what I'm saying is you see this amalgam of Greek influence, of Roman influence, of Persian influence, sort of converging in this sort of ideal that we could sort of start to describe as divine right, I suppose.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of
But,
sense.
it, but, it's definitely derivative from that transition that Diocletian carries out, which is then you might say centralized by Constantine, which then of course as we get to like the Christianization of Rome, it becomes formalized as a part of even our religious thinking, right?
Yeah,
As Christians.
so very indirect, if anything, but at least you can see sort of some hints of what's to come, at least with satraps. And then I want to bring this a little bit to sort of the um, uh, ancient Israelite um, and Judean history with the Davidic kingship, because there's obviously a lot of sort of the empire stuff has a lot more of its origins in sort of ancient pagan um, country or empires, and with Rome and stuff like that. But there's also uh, especially with Constantine and with Theodosius and other emperors in the future, as the Roman Empire becomes Christian, much of sort of there are influences from sort of the Davidic kingship, and mostly with Solomon. It's really kind of alluded to and not very well gone into, I guess, in the Bible
Hmm.
regarding Solomon's reign. Solomon, is granted wisdom by God, and that leads him to uh, great conquests and successes, uh, where he becomes much far wealthier than he uh, probably was good for him, and he eventually conquers a bunch of people and marries many. Has many wives of pagan countries outside of his, or even a part of his new lands that he conquered. And this is kind of an example of how sort of uh, Judean and sort of Christian morality comes into sort of maybe balancing out. at least in the future, of the imperial idea, because Solomon is shown to have sort of lost who he was, kind of in the same way Alexander does. I don't know if you would you agree with that? Does that sound similar?
I don't know enough about Solomon to be able to comment on that. But I'm also, isn't it true to some degree that actually David kind of lost his way through his
He
kingship as well?
he did, but the difference between him and Solomon is that he repented, um,
Okay.
and that Solomon never did.
So
Uh,
Solomon remained unrepentant, so to speak.
yeah, Solomon
Okay.
never had. He lost his. He became basically like a pagan king by the end
Hmm.
of his reign, because he had married all these women from different um who had all these different gods, and he took the temple that he had made for for the Israelite God, and basically added altars for other pagans, other pagan deities, in that same temple.
Hmm, interesting. Yeah, like I said, I'm not sort of familiar enough with Solomon to be able to have commented, but yeah, I do think there's an interesting sort of intersection here in that, and I think if you, I actually haven't, I actually need to get back to reading Aquinas because I haven't read Aquinas for literally years now, sort of at least since I was at uni, which is over 10 years ago. But there's an interesting kind of intersection between, should we say, call it Greco-Roman philosophy, um, and sort of what one might describe as so like Socratic principles or Aristotelian sort of ideals, and then it being sort of those ideas being sort of cast through a sort of a Christian, a moral Christian kind of um, mesh that sort of gives them a non-paganistic angle, as it were, or like a non-paganistic moral dimension, which otherwise it wouldn't have had, which is, I think, where the idea of, say, noblesse oblige will come from. Like the idea of just, you don't have power for the sake of having power, but as a king or as a noble of some kind, whether it was baron or an earl or a duke or whatever, a crown prince or whatever, your station might be, as a member of the nobility, is that, okay, you have these privileges, but you also have duties and responsibilities. And say, for example, even if you go outside of because I'm trying to think, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, certainly past the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, if you look at, say, Wulfstan, who wrote the Saxon laws, for King Ethelred. I'm pretty, yeah, actually, the Saxons would have been Christian by then. But even in that context, it's these Germanic tribal laws that are still sort of um, interpreted through a Christian dimension. So, as an Anglo-Saxon earl or a baron of somewhere in England, like Kent or you know Norfolk or wherever, Somerset, you had to bring your retinue to battle to serve under the English king. And as a lord, you were compelled to lead your men courageously in battle. And if you were sort of hard pressed or wounded, you could give ground, but you could never retreat. And to abandon your lord or even your soldiers by fleeing was basically an offense punishable by death. It's like, yes, you're given this privilege of ruling over these people and these lands, and this, to use the Saxon phraseology, a third, which is like basically a war band of soldiers. But with that came the responsibility of defending your territory and defending your lord, the king. And you would lead these men, and you couldn't abandon them in battle. And to do so, basically, you were either banished forever and you surrendered all your property, or if you returned to the kingdom, you'd be executed. Like, it's very black and white as to what these responsibilities are, and these sort of these balancing out of privileges with responsibilities and duties, which I think is in many ways, if not uniquely Christian, at the very least relatively uniquely European. Or at least I think there's aspects of both. Like there's certain aspects of the Roman ideal. Like I mentioned the Mos Maiorum earlier in the stream. The idea that for the Romans they would um, uh, they place a lot of importance on virtues such as disciplina, discipline, constantia, the ability to be sort of constant and upright, in all situations. To have gravitas, which means seriousness and composure. All these sort of various virtues, and then going back to what I was saying about like Wolfson and the Saxon laws. Um, there's this kind of interesting intersection where sort of like some of these old hallowed traditions that predate Christianity kind of bubble under the surface and even kind of like blend in with Christian morality, and then we sort of end up with kind of this chivalric code of the early and high Middle Ages. We end up with these sort of ideas of noblesse oblige and the idea of like divine right of kings, but it's not just. And again, this is probably one of the gripes I sort of have with how the modern world views words like dictator. It's just like, oh, if it's one person who rules, it's a bad thing. It's just like, well, actually, what we have today is the aberration of human history. Most rule has been done by a single person throughout the vast extent of human history, and in fact, in most places where they've had civilization, China, Persia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, wherever, right?
Mhm.
Um, but something interesting happens in Europe and amongst European civilizations that I don't think actually has comparison elsewhere. Certainly not to the same degree. I mean, the Japanese do conceive of the code of Bushido, but that's more of like a warrior code for a particular strata of people that didn't necessarily apply to like the shogun or the emperor, um, who again would almost be given like almost like a carte blanche to do whatever the hell they wanted. Whereas in the West, it's very much a different. It's taken in a very different context. But just to circle back to the Judean question, just very briefly, um, I think it's interesting that you raised Solomon, but David and Solomon, and the idea that you do have this interesting system where sort of Judea is strangely stratified in that you sort of have like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and these very sort of like religious sects who kind of sort of sit underneath the king and are sort of like a priest class, as it were, that existed above the well, I say that the Jewish people, but there's
Uh, I'm not sure that would be under. I
descendants
don't
of the
think
12
that's what it
tribes, but
was under the Davidic kingship, though. That would have been under,
well, that would have been the Herodians,
yeah,
the Herodian
Herodians.
dynasty. Yeah, true. But what I'm saying is, like, it eventually ended up being that, right? And and
Yeah.
obviously, if we call the people of Judea to be the descendants of the 12 tribes, from the Old Testament, um,
Well, Judea would just be two of the tribes, I think.
that being Judah and Israel,
Judah and Benjamin.
or Benjamin. Yeah, okay, yeah. So that, yeah, exactly. And so it's because I'm not actually, this is where someone like Lambda would probably be useful, because I know Lambda's done a lot of Old Testament reading and actually sort of understanding the dynamic of how like Judea and the people of Israel sort of like operated at that time. It's not really my forte, but it's sort of interesting in so far that obviously in Christianity we obviously include the Old Testament in our book, and then we sort of have like you know revelation that's sort of conveyed through Jesus. And we have the New Testament and the
Mhm.
Gospels and all that sort of stuff that sort of becomes essentially the basis for our morality. But like I said before, if I circle back, when I look at either um, Diocletian and Constantine, or whether I look at, say, the evolution of Germanic law, like in the Northern Europe, amongst the Anglo-Saxons, or even like the Germanic, the Teutons as like a group of Germanic peoples, um, and then the Franks as kind of like an amalgam of the Germanic peoples and Mediterranean Gallo-Roman peoples. Yeah, there's an interesting thing sort of plays out in a civilizational sense, where you sort of have this old world morality that predates Christianity that sort of intersects with Christianity, and you kind of get a melding of these two systems, which sort of creates our medieval conception of morality and law and governance that sort of then percolates to almost the modern age.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it's interesting because the what I was gonna say about sort of Solomon and sort of the whole point of why Israel could not become an empire really was because it it was basically the belief system, the structure of the belief system was mainly geared um towards Jews, and it wouldn't be until Christ that sort of the belief in sort of one God, the Trinity, and would then bring the well, Christianity would bring what was the Jewish ideas, and then this the fulfillment of those ideas into Christianity would bring that to the rest of the world. It was originally sort of um, a single people religion, and now it is a religion for all the nations. And Solomon, when he was embracing other pieces of culture, he was falling victim into sort of becoming a pagan himself. But when Christ comes, uh, Christians are able to sort of, because they are culturally of different varieties, they are able to sort of baptize their cultures into something anew, and basically that is where Christian kingship, Christian uh, empire becomes possible. While under the Davidic kingship prior, it would be impossible.
Yeah, yeah. I don't really have much to add to that. In because again, like I don't quite know enough about that period from the standpoint of the sort of kingdom of David and Solomon. But yeah, no, that what you said does make a good deal of sense. Um, what I would say is that
So yeah,
in
so
your
that's how I sort of what.
oh, no, I was just gonna say, in your opinion, how much of the legacy of the morality from, say, that uh, Davidian period do you feel remains intact or carries on sort of like a natural evolution to the Herodian period? Do you sort of see the society and their sort of moral frameworks change much in that time? And you got to think like between the two, you actually have, several occupations of Judea. They're conquered by the Assyrians, and then they're conquered by Cyrus, and then obviously they're conquered by Alexander. And then you have the wars of the Maccabees, etc. And then Herod sort of becomes a vassal of Rome to some extent. So do you sort of feel there's much of a change in Judean society from one to the other, in your opinion?
I mean, I think the classical understanding, the classical Christian understanding, is that the law was maintained, the moral law of Moses was maintained. It was obviously very Hellenized too, because um, they had been ruled by Greeks, and there were the Maccabean revolts and all of that. Um, but there was the law, but I mean, I think sort of one of the critiques Jesus makes is that they weren't following the spirit of the law. And so in some sense, the spirit of the morality was not being followed, but they would have been following the letter of the law, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And do you think also to some degree there's also a point where, because I did also mention like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and like there's obviously other groups that exist at the time of Herod, that because the priest class in the society of the Israelites was so preeminent, like put this way, the Romans, for instance, actually had although religion played a part to some degree in law insofar that it was a guiding principle to how the Romans practiced their law. There was a distinction between, like Roman lawyers. Like, for instance, Cicero was a lawyer before he became a senator, and the practice of law through a system of the judicial process, which sort of the Romans themselves kind of conceived of. Basically, the idea of a Western judicial system comes from Rome, right? And the courts that Rome actually established.
Hmm.
Um, but obviously, in from what I understand, even like reading through the Bible, and you sort of like read the Gospels, it kind of feels like the Israelite sort of religious sects and their I suppose you'd consider them like essentially the Pharisees are essentially like a proto rabbinic, they're like the pre-rabbis insofar that they're like a religious like layer essentially to their society, that they actually had a lot more involvement in terms of interpreting law, like intersecting with law, um, and to some degree probably like interfered with, if you could use the description, the judicial process, like far more than you'd see in like the Greek or Roman system.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how the Roman system worked with with the fact that there was kind of this subsystem under Herod and under the Sanhedrin. But from what I understand, sort of about because the problem with or the confusing part I think about um, Jewish law was that there was multiple different sort of sets of laws. There was the Levitical law. There was Deuteronomy. You know, these were different sets up for different reasons, and the strictness really was out of the fact that the Jews kept, or the Hebrews kept, failing. And from what I can tell, is that yes, from a sort of social situation, definitely the religious leaders had a lot to say with this, because they were the ones who basically brought Christ to trial. Like they could not put him to death, but it's almost sort of outside the law in some sense. Like they couldn't do certain things because they weren't in charge of everything, but they took it upon themselves to enforce rules according to their interpretation of Levitical and Deuteronomy law. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. Yeah, I have nothing more to add to that.
Okay.
I just think it's sort of like interesting how these, it's funny how like different geographies produce sort of different people have different interpretations of these things. Like it's a really interesting kind of case study almost from an anthropological standpoint. I mean, I'm no expert, for instance, in like law and governance or anything, right? I just read history and talk about it. But it's kind of interesting how in a relatively small geographical sort of area, you have the different systems developed by the Celts and the Germans, and then the Romans and the Greeks, and then the Israelites and the Persians and the Assyrians and Egypt, and it's all very different models, and sometimes there's actually quite significant cross pollination between them. I find it endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. So, and Christ comes and provides the because he is the heir to David. So while Herod is not of the Davidic line, uh, Jesus is. Um, he is the basically the king of Israel, the king of Judea, but just not in title, or not, I guess, not enthroned from a sort of from a physical standpoint. And that's why Herod, the first Herod, or Herod, I can't remember what his title is, but the first Herod, tries to have him killed. Um, and then uh, it's interesting. So there's Joseph, Saint Joseph, Jesus's adoptive father or earthly father, um, is is interestingly enough, basically dead by the time Jesus goes out and preaches, and preaches the Gospels, which I think has a lot to do with the fact that he becomes the head of the house of David at that time. There's this very much sort of kingship aspect to it. Is he would not be the king until Joseph died, because Joseph was the heir um, up until his death. So
Yeah,
it's kind of
head of house,
interesting.
so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, head of house, head of the house, but I mean, a penniless head of house, kind
Mm,
of,
yeah.
in some sense,
Well,
how.
because a lot of people tend to forget that Jesus was a carpenter, a humble carpenter. Like it's you know.
Yes, indeed. It's but like kind of the way we think of a lot of royalty these days that have been overthrown, or at least every time the Habsburgs keep having their property seized by whichever government. The last one was the Nazis, and they haven't been given their stuff back. So as Charles Coulomb likes to say, sort of they still have Nazi loot. The Austrian government still has
Mm-hmm.
Nazi loot, but won't give it back to the Habsburgs,
Mm-hmm.
their property. So that's one thing. Uh, which I think that's the only thing that probably our media will like look and be like, oh yeah, that's fine. The Nazis did that. Well, they probably had a good reason for it. Like that's the only thing they'd ever
Yeah.
say that about. But of course,
Yes.
people wouldn't mention. Most people don't mention it anyways. But
The unfortunate thing for the Habsburgs is that they were emperors in Europe and they weren't central bankers. But anyway, many such cases.
anyways, so basically you have sort of the penniless king, um, and his example with like the washing of the feet, uh, and just sort of and self-sacrificing or
Mhm.
self-sacrificial, um, sort of gives sort of the examples for Christian kingship, and that would be also Christian emperors as well going forward. And then we get to Constantine. Constantine. Are you familiar with the story of like the sign he saw and the dream he had and that sort of thing?
The Kiro and the Milvian Bridge. Yeah, no, I'm familiar with
Okay,
the story. Yeah.
will you mind enlightening us?
Well, yeah. So at this point in time, so I'll give it just a little bit of background. So Vespasian, um, Diocletian comes to power at the head of a coup after the death of Emperor Numerian, and Diocletian sort of at the head of a cadre of veteran officers from the Roman army. Very and rather than being bureaucratic, they're from a military background. They completely understand that Rome is ungovernable from Rome, as in the empire is ungovernable from one place, and there's far too much, um, shall I say, like bureaucratic and administrative sort of burden for one person to control. So he establishes what they call the tetrarchy, a rule of four. It actually begins as a rule of two, but then that's insufficient, and so they establish a rule of four. So there's Diocletian and his deputy Galerius in the east, and then it's Constantine's father, Flavius Constantius, and trying to think who his partner was in the west, father of Maximian, but I've just gone blank. Or Maxentius. Anyway, I can't remember. All the names start to sort of like gel together when you when you sort of go through them all. But eventually, what actually happens is that Constantine.
Whose son? Sorry.
Oh, I always get mixed up between Maxentius and Maximian, but anyway, I always forget who's the father and who's the son, because they're basically the deputy in the west under Constantine's
Isn't
father,
it
Constantius.
Maximinus or something?
Oh, anyway, yeah, so something like that. Anyway, I'm pretty sure the person that Constantine defeats at Milvian Bridge is actually Maxentius. But anyway, um, the the point is that because he's a son of a general, and this system is not meant to be um, hereditary, he ends up serving in the court of the East and ends up being a very successful. I believe he commands a legion for Diocletian / Galerius in the East, and actually leads many successful campaigns, against the Persians in the East and against the Goths beyond the Danube. And he's actually famed as a very successful and a very tenacious general. But then he eventually escapes his position in the Eastern Court, and utilizing the Roman sort of essentially the Imperial messaging service, he just goes from like post to post, picking up fresh horses. He rides hell for leather across the empire and eventually to his father's court, because his father is about to prepare a campaign into oh, you've dropped out. Anyway, I'll keep going. Um, uh, Maxentius. Constantine makes his way to modern day York, which was the Roman city of Eboracum, and his father's about to execute a campaign to go against to campaign against the Picts beyond Hadrian's Wall. But Flavius Constantius actually dies not long after Constantine arrives. So Constantine's basically proclaimed the deputy emperor in the West by Constantius' soldiers, and sort of the fait accompli Sorry, Connor, I kept going. You dropped out, so I just kept talking about
Yep, just
Constantine.
continue.
Sure. So basically, he escapes his position at the in court in the east under Galerius and Diocletian, and he rides hell for leather across the empire, makes his way to York, where his father's based, because his father's based in Britannia, but he's about to engage in a campaign with the Picts, who sort of populate modern day Scotland, and him. Constantine makes his way to York, where his father's gathering the army for campaign, but his father actually dies, and not long after Constantine arrives in the city, his father doesn't even start the campaign. And it's Constantius' soldiers who pronounce Constantine as an emperor. And Diocletian designed the system to be non-hereditary. But because essentially Constantine is now at the head of his father's army, but almost by accident, all the other emperors in the Tetrarchy sort of accept as a fait accompli that Constantine is emperor, and they really can't reverse it. He can't be unappointed essentially. And then sort of you have this sort of power play. Diocletian goes into retirement. Galerius becomes the chief emperor, the Augustus in the east. He brings in a successor to sort of fulfill his old position. I believe it's Licinius, if memory serves me correct. He was a general, another Roman general, and then in the west, power is shared between Constantine and then Maxentius, and eventually things come to a head between Constantine and Maxentius, where Constantine marches down through Italy and attempts to sort of become the absolute sort of control of the Western Roman world. And interestingly enough, Constantine's actually outnumbered. I think only just, but he's just outnumbered. He has to sort of cross, which in sort of military terms is difficult to actually cross a river and defeat an enemy army who sort of has a defensive advantage. But it's basically said that Constantine had a vision in the clouds in the sky, just on the outskirts of Rome, and it was like a symbol essentially of the Greek symbol, the Kyro, which is the two first letters of Christ's name in Greek, which is the CHI symbol, the Chi, and then Rho, which is we would recognize it as a P in English, but it's those two letters intersected, which is the Christian labrum, the signal of what we call the Kyro. That's where that signal comes from. He sees that in the sky, illuminated in the clouds, and I forget what the Greek translation of it is, but in Latin it says in hoc signo vinces, in this sign conquer. And then he instructs his men to paint the labrum on their shield. And then his army deploys for battle at Milvian Bridge, and you can actually see the Milvian Bridge today. It's still there in on the outskirts of Rome. And Maxentius' army just evaporates on contact. The battle is to describe how the sources basically say it's bloody and it's brief. Constantine completely outmaneuvers Maxentius, and Maxentius attempts to retreat across the Tiber to basically make his way to Rome, and he drowns in the river. And his army just disintegrates on contact, and then after the battle, they just run to the hills. And essentially, Constantine offers an amnesty to anyone who is prepared to join him, and basically incorporates the surviving elements of Maxentius' army into his own. And in a very short space of time, he becomes master of the West Roman world. And it's at that point where, because I believe at this point, Constantine's mother, who we know in sort of in Christian terms as Saint Helena or Saint Helen, is already a practicing Christian. She's already a member of the church, and Constantine is beginning to be persuaded as to the virtues and to you might say the truth of revelation. And this becomes increasingly true throughout his life, although Constantine doesn't live a particularly Christian life as we might understand it in a moral sense. But he's gradually persuaded by, at least at the surface level, he's persuaded by the arguments that are offered to him by the Christians via the old ways, the old religion of Rome, the old Hellenic pantheon, so to speak.
Indeed, yeah. And then Saint Helena and Constantine bring a lot of relics from the Holy Land to Rome, like Pilate's steps. I think are, in Rome because of them, if I'm not mistaken. And I think they find the true cross and that sort of thing. Anyway, so there's a lot of interesting elements that come about because of Constantine. And Constantine does, is it the Edict of Milan, which makes
Edict of Milan, yeah. That's the legalization, or rather, essentially the decriminalization of Christianity, I suppose you'd call it, because it has to be said that the as time has gone on in throughout Rome, and we actually see this under Emperor Decius or Decius. Once Rome starts to become inundated with plagues, they sort of tend to the Christians tend to get scapegoated for all these disasters that befall Rome. Like, and we have to understand that Diocletian and his peers, and this process even begun under one of his predecessors, Probus, of stabilizing the empire, happened in the course of what we call the third century crisis, which basically Rome almost ended two and a half centuries before it actually eventually ended up falling. The crisis was a very, very trying time for Rome. And at this point in time, Christianity became a somewhat popular movement, particularly, say, for example, in the Aegean, in Egypt, parts of Syria, and even in parts of, say, southern Italy and Spain. Christianity started gaining something of a following. And so it was kind of felt that this sort of religious sect that was sort of bubbling underneath the surface of Roman society was becoming something of a problem. And so emperors such as Decius, particularly Constantine, and very much Galerius as well, undertook essentially pogroms against the Christian minority within the empire, which then Constantine kind of reverses this first with the Edict of Milan, which essentially is the legalization or the decriminalization of the practice of the Christian religion, and then eventually, sort of as the ostensible head of the church, although he's not technically pope, but as sort of like the imperial head of the Christian church, he he sort of masterminds eventually the Council of Nicaea, which
yeah,
started the formalization of the church.
official, like head layman kind of thing.
Yeah, you could call it
Um,
that. Yeah, because
uh,
that tradition actually continues on, like in the Greek world, like after the fall of West Rome, Latin Rome, and as the Byzantine continues, the Byzantine Empire continues in the east, centered around Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor and the Patriarch of Constantinople maintain this relationship for the duration of the Byzantine Empire. So
I
it's a really
mean,
interesting dynamic that happens.
it continues up until, you could say, the the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, with the the veto of one of the elections of a pope, in like early 1900s, I think it was. uh
True, true. But I mean this in insofar that like, say, for example, in the West, for example, there's very much this, certainly up until the period of the Reformation, the Counter Reformation, and the whole Protestant movement under Luther, is that there's very much this idea of, okay, kings and princes and the Western nobility are in a sense of at least spiritually subservient to the Pope in Rome. That the Pope in Rome wielded a lot of, um, I mean, he did wield some temporal power, but it was very much a case of your rule is ordained by God, but essentially God functions through me as the Pope. Ergo, don't step out of line, otherwise, as the Pope, you'll be excommunicated. Like
mhm,
there's a bit of that went on, a lot of that, but that went on in the Middle Ages. Whereas in the East, in Constantinople, there's very much this peer-to-peer relationship between the Patriarch and the Emperor
mhm,
that lasts for as long as that empire does live. And basically, once the last emperor was killed at the siege of Constantinople, and then once the Patriarch of Constantinople sort of fell under the auspices of the Sultan, as he was essentially used as the head of the Greek community within the empire, that dynamic forever changes. Like there's not
yeah,
that peer-to-peer relationship anymore. But the point I was making is that it's very interesting how this relationship that begins under Constantine, and sort of whilst Rome is still unified, starts this trend, and then that trend then carries on in the East. Is, I suppose, the point I'm trying to make.
yeah, I guess it's more, the pope has a little bit of an edge maybe in the West, when Rome falls, um in the West, and doesn't in the East. Do you think, have we missed anything with sort of the imperial origins, or the origins of the imperial idea, I should say? Is there anything
Not that,
else that?
not that I can think of. But, I mean, in the end, it's sort of like, because we've sort of touched back on Constantine and Diocletian, is it a very much? is a hinge point. You know, you can really say that the establishment, because I mean, we actually haven't talked a whole lot about Augustus, kind of just mentioned him in passing recently
Oh yes.
in this stream. But you know, the idea of Augustus establishes this first Western Imperium, because we have to think that, okay, the Etruscans had kings, but they were kind of like very informally kings, and they appointed kings to Rome as to act as like a vassal sort of overlord. But you know, like for example, Vercingetorix wasn't actually really a king of the Gauls insofar that he was sort of like an elected leader of the Gauls as a confederation fighting, you know, Caesar's legions as like the preeminent general of the Roman Republic. You know, and even like the Samnites themselves actually had a very similar system to the Romans of sort of being governed by two rulers at any given time. They weren't consuls in the same way that Rome was, but you know, again, it was sort of like a diarchy. You know, Sparta had the rule of two kings. Some Greek city states actually had oligarchies as such, and obviously Macedon had a king as well. But it's not particularly common. It's not everywhere. Whereas, like, you know, we said before, you know, like in the East, you know, the Lydians had a king, the Cappadocians had a king, you know, the Mitanni had a king, you know, the Assyrians had kings, the Babylonians had kings. You know, it's a very common thing in the East, and so you sort of have like this stepped kind of ascendancy towards the establishment of both kingship and imperium in the West. And it's Augustus creates this idea of, it's called princeps, you know, first among equals, but he becomes the emperor of Rome. You know, imperator as a term in older history, in older Roman history, like in Republican Rome, imperator was simply a word used for general. It was almost you could almost use it in the same way that the Greeks even today use the word strategos, which means, you know, general, essentially, right? But then the imperator became essentially the emperor, and it's how we've come to refer to as the empire. So, you know, it's essentially where we get the etymology for the word empire and imperial is from imperator. And
Yet we get in other languages, emperor comes more from Caesar.
well, yeah, I was going to say you have Tsar and Kaiser, which are descendant of the word Caesar, but that's because Caesar becomes a rank. Um, Firstly, in many ways, the early emperors, if you look at, say, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, I mean, we have, you know, we call them by, you know, they're Augustus and Tiberius and Caligula and Nero and whatever we call them, Claudius, we call them as they are. But if you actually look at their full names, it's, you know, like Caesar, you know, Caesar Augustus, you know, Julius Claudius, you know, it's like a 4, 5, 6 letter word sort of title that sort of encompasses the entire naming of that person, you know. And so they incorporate Caesar and Augustus into their names, which becomes a part of their title essentially. And so and you really see this particularly in Byzantium, where they actually end up having a lot of titles for a lot of different ranks, both in terms of the government of the empire, but also within the court. And so in Byzantium, you would have the emperor. I think this was after Heraclius. He sort of changes the Latin to Greek, right? Because it's actually during his reign where the transformation happens linguistically. At least it's formalized, right? But they're no longer, they don't use the word imperator, they use the word basileos, which in Greek means, you know, we would say, you know, basileus in English. But essentially it's the same thing, but it's just in Greek. But they would use words like, for example, I think the full title, the part of the full title of the Byzantine emperor was autocrator of Greeks and Romans, essentially. So Basileus and autocrator could be used interchangeably. But then at the same time, it was still referred to as an empire, in that if you look at the way the Greeks describe their own entity, Basileaton Romeon, Empire of Romans, right? It's just a difference in like essentially like transliteration, like using the Greek rather than the Latin, right? But the words are the same. But then at the same time, Augustus, which is the Greek translation of Augustus, is still used in documentation. But it's just used interchangeably, like autocrat or Augustus could be substituted to mean the same thing. But an emperor's successor or an emperor's son would be given the title Kaiser, Caesar. And so it's from that we essentially get this idea that in places like Germany and Russia, who would then use words Kaiser and Tsar respectively, were more the usage of the lesser title rather than the chief title. So rather than styling themselves as Augustuses or autocrators, they styled themselves as Caesars in the sense that, like, and I dare say I don't actually know this. This is purely a theory, but because there was at least two major occasions where the Byzantines married off princesses to Russian or Rus or Rus, I suppose, um, aristocracy. So there was, I think it was a relative of John Zemisky's married one of the princes of Kiev, and then that's when they adopted Orthodox Christianity. It was basically on the promise of marrying the daughter of the emperor, he would convert to Orthodoxy and convert his druzhina and his court to Orthodoxy, and they became Orthodox. And that was the Grand Prince of Kiev, and then right at the fall of Constantinople, I think Sophia Palaiologos might have been the niece of the last emperor, Constantine the 11th. Um,
Hmm.
and she married, I believe, one of the princes of Muscovy. And so there's the idea that essentially the aristocracy of Russia are not only sort of metaphorical or like loose descendants of East Rome, of Byzantium and the Orthodox Church, but they actually are by marriage. And so maybe there's an idea or a sense that being the descendants of Byzantium makes them the Caesars of the legacy rather than actually being the Augustuses of that legacy, if that makes sense. Because like
Yeah.
they're married into the female line rather than being the male descendants, if that makes sense. I don't necessarily know. I'm just positing that question, but I've
Yeah.
always figured that might actually play a role into why they've used different names for titles. And then simply, if the Germans have used Kaiser, it's just simply as a Germanification of the Russian use of Tsar or something. I don't know.
Do you do you know
It's
what
interesting topic.
Charlemagne would have used?
Um, Rex, I believe, because he was crowned
He-
king of the Romans by the Pope.
Okay, so he wouldn't have been, but he wouldn't have been referred to as emperor or any of any kind.
I mean, to my knowledge, he was crowned king of Rome by the Pope on
Okay.
Christmas Day. So I can't remember what year that was exactly, but I don't think he adopted the use emperor because I believe he was crowned king of Rome.
What
And
about Otto? He was the first official Holy Roman Emperor, right?
well, that's the thing, yeah.
He would have
But,
been Kaiser, right?
yeah, well, exactly. Actually, this is where I probably need to even rewatch the streams I did with AM about this because I know
That,
we sort of we touched on this,
which is kind of what I'm thinking too.
because
Like I'm like,
yeah, because essentially we did Nations of Charlemagne. We sort of touched on this, and I've just sort of briefly forgotten. Funny enough, we got to the topic. I didn't think we were going to talk about Charlemagne. So I didn't even think of it. But
I
yeah,
yeah, I didn't think about that either. But my
mm,
you have your theory. I want to put out my theory, and this is completely just speculation. There's no evidence of it necessarily, but I was thinking more along the lines of like as the idea of emperor becomes more Christian, um, the use of the secondary title might make a lot more sense because there's sort of a recognition of of Christ as maybe the Augustus in some sense without needing an Augustus on or like a, a physical Augustus on Earth.
yeah, I think that part plays a part. But in the end, if it's an Augustus on Earth, like why not a translation of Augustus rather than Caesar? Like that's still the odd thing, right? They use
Well,
the lesser title rather than the higher title.
well, that's what I'm saying. So to lead deference, basically,
Oh, as into like in a spiritual context, the God you mean, or
yes, to God
oh,
being
okay,
like
okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
maybe God is the eternal Augustus, so therefore
Hmm.
the title is no longer necessary. Maybe, but that again,
Interesting. Yeah.
total theory, not just an idea.
Yeah. No. No. That's an interesting thought experiment. I've actually never thought of that myself, but it makes for an interesting one. And again, it sort of it's indicative of this interplay between this meshing of, say, Roman bureaucracy, Roman government, Roman notions of imperium, then being tempered by the Christian ideal and world vision of that, you know, God is like a divine Augustus in a sense, and then like the emperor is his Caesar, as it were, in the same way that sort of like God's vicar is the Pontifex Maximus.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
essence, that same kind of dynamic.
yeah, exactly. So that'd be interesting. I think I might ask Charles Coulomb about that. What he thinks about that.
That'd be an interesting
Um,
point for sure.
but yeah, so I think that unless you have anything to wrap up, I think that's a great place to halt, because we've sort of inched our way into sort of the ideas of Christian
Mm.
imperial idea, and I'm going to cover that in much more detail with Charles Coulomb,
Hmm.
hopefully later this week, maybe
Yeah.
a little further down the line. So people can follow Marcus on
Oh,
Twitter.
can I finish on a point
Oh,
just
sure.
briefly?
Yep.
Sorry, just I actually just want to wind back because and I do owe this to our anyone who's Persian watching this. Because I was quite unsure about the story of Astyages, and I was just wondering if just I could
Okay.
tell the story just so I didn't sound like I was talking nonsense. I've actually just pulled up like the Wikipedia, but I just want to read the prophecy if I can.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just reading this verbatim from Wiki, so anyone can read this and it's there. But I'll just, for the sake of the discussion, I just want to make it clear that there was a prophecy and that this sort of is said to have taken place. The account given by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus relates that Astyages had a dream in which his daughter Menedane gave birth to a son who would destroy his empire. Fearful of the dream's prophecy, Astyages married her off to Cambyses of Anshan, who had a reputation of being a quiet and thoughtful prince, and whom Astyages believed to be no threat. And of course, Anshan is a province which gave rise to, it's where I believe Pasargadae was located, and that's where Cyrus actually rebelled from. So just keep that in mind. When a second dream warned Astyages of the dangers of Mandane's offspring, Astyages sent his general Harpagus to kill the child Cyrus. Herodotus correctly names Cyrus's parents, though he fails to mention that Cambyses was king. Cambyses was a king. Modern scholarship generally rejects this claim that Cyrus was the grandson of Astyages. Harpagus was unwilling to spill royal blood nor murder an infant, so he gave the infant to a shepherd, Mithridates, whose wife had just given a stillborn child. Cyrus was raised as Mithridates' own son, and Harpagus presented the stillborn child to Astyages as the dead Cyrus. However, when Cyrus was found alive at age 10, Astyages spared the boy on the advice of his magi, returning him to his parents in Anshan. Harpagus, however, did not escape punishment, as Astyages is said to have fed him to his own son at a banquet. Cyrus succeeded his father in 559 BC and 553 BC on the advice of Harpagus, who was eager for revenge for being given the abominable supper. Cyrus rebelled against Astyages. After 3 years of fighting, Astyages' troops mutinied during the battle for Pasargadae, and Cyrus conquered the Median Empire. Astyages was spared by Cyrus, and despite being taunted by Harpagus, Herodotus says that he was it doesn't matter. Herodotus says that he was treated well and remained in Cyrus's court until his death. So, yeah, I wasn't talking nonsense about the prophecy. I just forgot elements of it, but that's kind
Okay.
of the story of Astyages and Cyrus. There is that kind of that the child escaping in the reeds kind of thing and given to a shepherd. That does tend to crop up because it's a part of, like, with Romulus and Remus, you have like the she wolf suckling them on the Tiber, like that's there, and then there's like the story of like I always forget, I always get confused between Moses and David in this sense, but like there's the baby in the reeds and being spared from the Pharaoh, and then if you
Yeah.
go to Herod's Judea, the red marking of the door of Passover, because the boy will destroy the kingdom. These themes happen to crop up time and again in history that could arguably converge with mythology. Like these there's a lot of interesting. It's kind of like how every old religion actually has like a flood story, and whether it's like
Yeah.
the Australian Aboriginals or the old Japanese or the Chinese or the or like in the West, with the Ark and Noah, there's like a great flood inundation story in almost every sort of cultural memory, which sort of how can this happen? How can this convergence happen over such a vast different distance of time and area, but yet everyone has like global inundation story? It's just a fascinating thing that tends to crop up in old sort of mythological history, if you could call it that.
Very true. Yes, indeed. Well, Marcus, you do something very difficult, which is you make somebody who currently is really sort of focused on maybe modern history at the moment, um, actually enjoy ancient history, which I've always been daunted by ancient history, and but you make it quite interesting for me. So I
Well,
applaud
thank
you
you.
for that.
I'm glad yourself and your audience and some people can tolerate and appreciate my tangential kind of darting off in several directions at once. So
Well, it
it
kind of
is it is
works
it is
with
good.
sort of my bullet points, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. You,
Yeah. Sometimes
yeah.
you need to be tangential to cover dot points, but yeah, no, it's always fabulous, and I always love talking about these subjects. Always very fascinating. Although sometimes, like I do find that if I don't get time to do the sufficient reading, or like like I was telling you pre-show, like I actually ordered a book like a month ago, still hasn't arrived. It's Adrian Goldworthy's new book about Persian Rome, and it still hasn't arrived. Like I even ordered a present for my father, like a particular book about it was the writing of a surgeon who served in like the Russian theater of World War II, and like it was meant to get like arrived like 2 weeks before Christmas, and it got here like after Christmas. So I don't know what's going with the postal service, but there's just
Yeah,
some stuff I've ordered that hasn't arrived on time or at all. And
that's
I was a
unfortunate.
little bit sort of unprepared, and then real life gets in the way and things get busy, and it's always sort of hard to have the background, because like I felt a bit embarrassed about that story about Astiagi's. Like I knew that there was that story, but I couldn't remember it in its entirety, and it's like no, I got to do justice to anyone who's Persian here. I don't want to butcher this story. That's why
Well,
I appreciate you allowing me to read at the end, because it was important. It's important for people's stories to be told properly. You know what I mean? And for it to be truthful, and as someone who loves history, authentic information matters, even if it does touch on mythology. People's like national history and cultural legacy kind of deserves to be told, particularly great civilization like Persia, which should be spoken of in a similar esteem to Greece and to Rome and to Egypt, even China. In some respect, they are great civilizations, and they deserve their due deference. They deserve their due deference.
well said. But for people looking for more of your content, will have your Twitter in the
Hmm.
description. And if anybody wants to listen to you on Apostolic Majesty stream, they can find streams. They can find you there, as well as
We have many
uh,
hours of content there on AM channel, that's for sure.
and then Academic Agent has you on from time to time as well.
Hmm.
Is there any other
Indeed.
place that you've are commonly found?
No, not really. I just sort of my nonsense on Twitter, which is often unrelated to what I actually talk about on streams. But yeah, and like occasionally this is our second stream we've had together, which was thoroughly enjoyable. Every so often I'll jump on with Oron McIntyre. Actually, funnily enough, if you want to delve more into the Caesar thing, I did a very very good stream about the idea and the historicity of Caesar with Oron. That was, I think it was in September, October. I might have done it. I can't remember exactly. Sort of like in the back end of last year.
Yeah, I
Um,
think I listened to that too. It was very good, but
yeah,
your work sometimes blends for me.
yeah, as it often does. And the worst thing is, like, I sort of dart from time period. It's like Aim and I will talk about, like Austria-Hungary or like the Franco-Prussian War, and then the next minute we're talking, like the Greco-Persian Wars, and then it's the Rome's conquest of Gaul, and then it's the Crusades, and it sort of darts around everywhere. And Aim and I read a lot of material to actually canvas all these points, because usually people will specialize in a particular era of history, and then we sort of canvas. We do these big broad brushes, and you sort of need to go through a lot of material to get through them. Um, the other thing I'll say is that Oren and I are planning on doing a part two, but again, I need to do some more reading on it, and that is this whole what is a dictator and what's the historical relevance of dictator. And I'm actually glad we touched on it today, because it is kind of important. And Oren and I are going to talk about, because obviously that's a word that gets thrown around in modern journalism. And again, it's a very inaccurate word when used in its incorrect context, as modernists do misuse it. Yeah, so there's a couple of those sort of streams. I haven't really been anywhere else. Oh, actually, myself and Prudentialist occasionally stream. So if you look on Prudentialist's channel, there's about 3 or 4 episodes where we've done things together, and often, if anyone who cares about what's going on in Ukraine, Russia, every so often, every few months, myself, Charlemagne, Prudentialist, Semigog, we just sort of do periodic updates of that there. So you'll find me there as well. And yeah, no, that's about it. And I mean, in the end, if hopefully I get my hands on these books, and if we want to have an addendum or something at the in a few months' time, or indeed if you fancy having both myself and AM on, maybe we can come on for a joint stream or something. We'll see what happens.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure having you. Thank you everyone for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And God bless. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.